William stared at the coffee mug in his hands, watching the steam rise and disappear into the cold morning air. The kitchen felt too quiet, too empty. Catherine should have been there, humming her favorite song while making breakfast. Instead, her chair sat empty, and the silence pressed against his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. 3 months ago, everything had been different. Catherine had been laughing, planning their summer garden, talking about the roses she wanted to plant near the back fence. Her cheeks had been pink with excitement as she showed him pictures from gardening magazines, pointing out the varieties she thought would thrive in their yard. "Look at these climbing roses, William," she had said, her finger tracing the glossy page. "Imagine how beautiful they'll look growing up the trellis by our bedroom window." He had smiled and nodded, not really paying attention to the flowers, but watching the way her eyes lit up when she talked about their future together. After 32 years of marriage, he still loved the way she got excited about simple things. It was one of the reasons he had fallen in love with her all those years ago. But then came the headaches. At first, Catherine had brushed them off as stress from her job at the elementary school. She had always been dedicated to her students, staying late to grade papers and prepare lessons. The headaches seemed normal for someone who worked as hard as she did. "Maybe you should take a break," William had suggested one evening when he found her sitting in the dark living room, pressing her palms against her temples. "It's just the end of the school year," she had replied. "You know how crazy things get with testing and graduation preparations." William had accepted her explanation because he wanted to believe it was nothing serious. He had brought her aspirin and made her favorite tea, hoping the pain would go away with rest and relaxation. Summer arrived, and Catherine's headaches became more frequent. She started canceling plans with friends, saying she was too tired to go to their weekly book club meetings. The woman who had once spent entire weekends working in their garden now struggled to water the potted plants on their front porch. "I think I might need glasses," she had said one morning, squinting at the newspaper. "The words keep getting blurry." William had made an appointment with the eye doctor, but deep down, something told him this was more than just needing reading glasses. He watched his wife struggle with simple tasks, saw how she gripped the kitchen counter when waves of dizziness hit her, noticed how she had started walking more slowly as if each step required extra concentration. The eye doctor had been the first to suggest something might be wrong. After examining Catherine's eyes, he had recommended she see a neurologist. The word had hung in the air between them, like a dark cloud. "A neurologist?" Catherine had asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Why would I need to see a brain doctor?" William had reached for her hand in the car afterward, feeling how cold her fingers had become. They had driven home in silence, both of them afraid to voice what they were thinking. The neurologist's office had sterile white walls and uncomfortable chairs that squeaked whenever someone moved. William remembered every detail of that day because it was the moment their lives began to change forever. They had waited for what felt like hours before Dr. Martinez called them into his office. "We need to run some tests," Dr. Martinez had explained after listening to Catherine describe her symptoms. "Brain scans, blood work, a few other things to help us understand what's causing these headaches and vision problems." Catherine had gripped William's hand so tightly during the MRI that his fingers went numb, but he hadn't minded. He would have let her break every bone in his hand if it meant taking away her fear. The test results had taken a week to come back, and those 7 days had been the longest of William's life. He had tried to act normal, going to work at the hardware store, helping customers pick out screws and paint colors, pretending his world wasn't potentially falling apart. Catherine had thrown herself into cleaning the house, organizing closets and scrubbing floors with an intensity that worried him. It was as if she was trying to prepare for something, though neither of them wanted to say what that might be. "The house has never been cleaner," she had joked one evening, but her smile hadn't reached her eyes. When Dr. Martinez called them back to his office, William could tell from the doctor's expression that the news wasn't good. The man's usually warm smile was missing, and he kept looking down at the papers on his desk instead of meeting their eyes. "I'm afraid the scans show a tumor," Dr. Martinez had said gently. "It's located in a part of your brain that controls several important functions." The words had hit William like a physical blow. He remembered the way Catherine's hand had gone limp in his, how her face had turned pale, how the room had suddenly felt like it was spinning. "Is it cancer?" Catherine had whispered. Dr. Martinez had nodded slowly. "We'll need to do a biopsy to determine exactly what type and what treatment options might be available." The drive home from that appointment had been the longest 20 minutes of William's life. Catherine had stared out the passenger window without saying a word, and he had gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We'll fight this," he had finally said as they pulled into their driveway. "Whatever it takes, we'll fight it together." Catherine had looked at him then, and he had seen something in her eyes that scared him more than the doctor's diagnosis. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was resignation, as if she had already started saying goodbye. "William," she had said softly, "what if fighting isn't enough?" He had refused to accept that possibility. Over the next few days, he had researched everything he could find about brain tumors, treatment options, survival rates, and experimental therapies. He had filled notebooks with information, made lists of questions for doctors, and started planning their battle against this disease. Catherine had watched him work, had seen the hope and determination in his eyes, but she had been thinking about different things. While he planned for treatments and recovery, she had been thinking about time, about what really mattered, about all the things she wanted to say and do while she still could. The biopsy had confirmed their worst fears. The tumor was aggressive and inoperable. Dr. Martinez had explained treatment options, but his tone had made it clear that they were buying time, not curing the disease. "How long?" William had asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "It's hard to say exactly," Dr. Martinez had replied. "With treatment, possibly 6 to 12 months. Without treatment, maybe 3 to 6 months." Catherine had chosen to fight, not because she believed she could win, but because she saw how much William needed her to try. They had started chemotherapy the following week, and William had driven her to every appointment, had held her hand during every treatment, had cleaned up after her when the medication made her sick. The treatments had been brutal. Catherine's beautiful auburn hair had fallen out in clumps, leaving her scalp bare and vulnerable. She had lost weight rapidly, her clothes hanging loose on her shrinking frame. But the worst part had been watching the light in her eyes grow dimmer with each passing day. "I look like a stranger," she had said one morning, staring at herself in the bathroom mirror. William had come up behind her and wrapped his arms around her thin shoulders. "You look like the woman I love," he had whispered against her ear. "You'll always be beautiful to me." She had leaned back against his chest, and he had felt how fragile she had become, how her bones seemed too close to the surface of her skin. As autumn arrived, it became clear that the treatments weren't working. The tumor was growing despite the chemotherapy, and Catherine's condition was deteriorating rapidly. She had started having trouble with her balance, her speech had become slurred at times, and she had begun forgetting simple words. "Maybe it's time to stop the treatments," she had suggested one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the leaves change colors. "Don't give up," William had pleaded. "There might be other options, other doctors, experimental treatments." Catherine had taken his hand in both of hers, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm not giving up," she had said. "I'm choosing how I want to spend whatever time I have left." That conversation had marked the beginning of the end, though William hadn't wanted to accept it. Catherine had stopped the chemotherapy and chosen palliative care instead, focusing on comfort rather than cure. She had started making lists of things she wanted to do, people she wanted to see, conversations she needed to have. "I want to call my sister," she had said one morning, "and I want to write letters to the kids." William's throat had tightened. Catherine's sister lived in California, and they had talked about visiting her for years, but had never found the time. Their adult children lived busy lives in different cities, and visits had become rare occasions centered around holidays and special events. "Of course," William had managed to say, "whatever you want to do." Catherine had spent the next few weeks reaching out to people from different parts of her life. Old friends from college, former students, neighbors they hadn't spoken to in years. She had approached each conversation with a kind of peaceful urgency, as if she was trying to tie up loose ends and make peace with her past. William had listened to her talk on the phone, had seen how these conversations seemed to give her energy even as her body continued to fail. She had laughed with old friends, had cried with family members, had shared memories and feelings that had been stored away for years. "I never realized how much I needed to say," she had told him one evening. "All these words I've been carrying around, all these feelings I never expressed." The letters to their children had been the hardest thing to watch. Catherine had spent hours at the kitchen table, writing in her careful handwriting, stopping frequently to rest her cramping fingers. She had written separate letters to each of their 3 children, plus letters for future grandchildren she would never meet. For birthdays and holidays, she wouldn't be there to celebrate. "What are you writing about?" William had asked gently. "Everything," Catherine had replied, not looking up from her paper. "All the things a mother wants her children to know, all the advice I wish I could give them, all the love I want them to remember." William had found himself watching Catherine differently during those weeks. He had memorized the way she moved, the sound of her voice, the way she smiled when something amused her. He had started taking pictures constantly, trying to capture every expression, every gesture, every moment they had left together. "You're staring at me," Catherine had teased one afternoon when she caught him watching her read. "I'm trying to remember everything," he had admitted. She had put down her book and looked at him with the kind of understanding that came from 3 decades of marriage. "You won't need to try so hard," she had said. "Love has a way of keeping the important things alive." As November arrived, Catherine's condition had worsened dramatically. She had started sleeping more during the day, had lost her appetite almost completely, and had begun having episodes where she seemed confused about where she was or what year it was. The hospice nurse had started visiting daily, helping William understand what to expect, teaching him how to make Catherine more comfortable. The woman, named Sarah, had been gentle and knowledgeable, but her presence had made everything feel more real, more final. "These changes are normal," Sarah had explained after Catherine had slept through an entire afternoon. "Her body is starting to shut down, and sleep is becoming more important to her than staying awake." William had nodded, but inside he had been screaming. Nothing about this felt normal to him. Nothing about watching his wife disappear piece by piece felt like something he could accept or understand. During Catherine's lucid moments, they had talked about practical things. She had shown him where she kept important papers, had explained how to work the washing machine's complicated settings, had written down recipes for his favorite meals. "You'll be okay," she had said repeatedly, as if she was trying to convince both of them. "I don't want to be okay without you," he had replied honestly. Catherine had smiled sadly. "I know, but I need you to try. I need to know that you'll find ways to be happy after I'm gone." Those conversations had become more difficult as Catherine's energy decreased. By late November, she was spending most of her time in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, occasionally opening her eyes to smile at William or squeeze his hand. He had moved a chair next to their bed and had started sleeping there, afraid to miss any moment she might be awake and wanting to talk. He had read to her from her favorite books, had played music she loved, had told her stories about their early years together. "Do you remember our first apartment?" he had asked one evening as she lay with her eyes closed. A small smile had crossed Catherine's face. "The one with the leaky faucet and the neighbors who fought all the time. We thought we were so grown up," William had continued. "Living on our own, eating cereal for dinner because we didn't know how to cook." "I was so scared," Catherine had whispered, "but you made everything feel safe." Those had been some of their last real conversations. As December arrived, Catherine had become less responsive, speaking only occasionally and in short phrases that sometimes didn't make complete sense. William had continued talking to her anyway, believing she could hear him even when she couldn't respond. He had told her about his day, had shared memories, had promised her that he would take care of the things that mattered to her. "The roses you wanted to plant," he had said one morning. "I'll put them in next spring. I'll plant them right where you wanted them, by the bedroom window." Catherine's eyes had fluttered open for a moment, and she had looked directly at him with a clarity that surprised him. "Promise me," she had whispered. "I promise," he had said, taking her hand. "I promise I'll plant your roses." She had closed her eyes again, but her grip on his hand had tightened slightly, and he had known she had heard him. The first week of December brought an early snowstorm that covered their small town in a blanket of white silence. William stood at the bedroom window, watching the flakes fall steadily, remembering how Catherine had always loved the first snow of winter. She would have insisted they go for a walk, would have caught snowflakes on her tongue like a child, would have made hot chocolate afterward while her cheeks were still pink from the cold. Now she lay in their bed. Breathing so quietly, he sometimes had to lean close to make sure she was still alive. Her face had become gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin that seemed almost translucent. But even in her declining state, William could see traces of the young woman he had married, the teacher who had dedicated her life to helping children learn and grow. Dr. Martinez had stopped by the day before, making one of his regular house calls. He had checked Catherine's pulse, had listened to her breathing, had spoken quietly with William in the hallway outside their bedroom. "Her body is shutting down," the doctor had explained gently. "The process is becoming faster now. It could be days, maybe a week at most." William had nodded, though the words felt impossible to accept. How could someone who had been so alive, so vibrant, just stop existing? How could 32 years of shared mornings and inside jokes and quiet conversations simply end? Sarah, the hospice nurse, had increased her visits to twice daily. She had shown William how to give Catherine the medication that would keep her comfortable, had taught him to recognize the signs that her condition was changing, had prepared him for what the final stages might look like. "She's not suffering," Sarah had assured him repeatedly. "The medication is managing any pain, and this deep sleep is peaceful for her. She's aware that you're here, even when she can't respond." William had found comfort in that thought. He had continued talking to Catherine, reading aloud from the romance novels she loved, playing the classical music that had always relaxed her. Sometimes he thought he saw her lips curve into the faintest smile when he spoke, though he couldn't be sure if it was real or just his desperate hope. Their children had come home. Michael had driven up from Atlanta with his wife and 2 young daughters. Sarah had flown in from Seattle, leaving her job as a graphic designer to spend time with her mother. David, their youngest, had taken a leave from his teaching position in Chicago and was staying in his old bedroom. The house felt full in a way it hadn't for years, but the activity was subdued, respectful of the quiet battle being fought in the master bedroom. The grandchildren, ages 6 and 8, had been confused at first about why Grandma couldn't play with them, why everyone spoke in whispers, why their parents' eyes were always red and swollen. Michael had tried to explain in simple terms. "Grandma is very sick," he had told his daughters as they sat in the living room surrounded by the family photos Catherine had arranged so carefully over the years. Her brain isn't working right anymore, and her body is getting ready to stop working too. Is she going to die? 8-year-old Emma had asked with the directness that only children possessed. Michael had looked helplessly at William, unsure how to answer. William had knelt down to Emma's level and taken her small hands in his. "Yes, sweetheart," he had said softly. "Grandma is going to die soon, but that doesn't mean she stops loving you. Love stays even after people go away." Emma had started crying then, and William had held her while his own tears fell silently. 6-year-old Grace had crawled onto his lap too, and he had sat there in Catherine's favorite chair, holding his granddaughters while they grieved for the grandmother they were about to lose. The children had taken turns sitting with Catherine, reading her stories, showing her drawings they had made, telling her about school and friends and the things they were excited about for Christmas. Catherine hadn't responded, but William believed she could hear their young voices, could feel their love surrounding her. "Grandma always made the best cookies," Emma had said one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the bed next to Catherine's still form. "Daddy, do you think she can teach me the recipe when she gets better?" Michael had exchanged a heartbroken look with William. "Maybe Grandpa knows the recipe," he had suggested gently. William had found Catherine's handwritten recipe book that evening, had flipped through pages covered in her neat writing, notes about adjustments she had made, reminders about family members' favorite variations. Each page was a memory, a moment from their life together preserved in flour and sugar and love. Sarah, his daughter, had spent hours organizing Catherine's belongings, going through jewelry boxes and photo albums, asking William to tell her stories about the items she found. It was her way of saying goodbye, of holding on to pieces of her mother that she could take with her. "Tell me about this," Sarah had said, holding up a simple silver bracelet. "I gave that to your mother for our 5th anniversary," William had remembered. "We didn't have much money then, but she wore it every day for years until the clasp broke. I kept meaning to get it fixed." Sarah had smiled through her tears. "I'll get it fixed. I'll wear it so she's always with me." David, their youngest at 26, had struggled the most with his mother's condition. He had been Catherine's baby, the child who had stayed closest to home for the longest time. Watching him try to process the loss had been almost as painful for William as watching Catherine slip away. "She was supposed to see me get married," David had said one evening as they sat together on the front porch, needing a break from the intensity inside the house. "She was supposed to meet her grandchildren from me. She had so many plans for things we were going to do." "She knows you love her," William had replied. "That's what matters most to her." "But it's not enough," David had said angrily. "It's not enough that she knows. I wanted more time. I wanted years more time." William had understood that anger because he felt it too, the unfairness of losing Catherine when they should have had decades left together, the cruelty of a disease that took away everything she was piece by piece. But he had also learned something during the long months of Catherine's illness. "The time we had was enough because we loved each other completely," he had told his son. "Your mother lived a full life. She was loved and she loved deeply. Not everyone gets that." As the days passed, Catherine's breathing became more labored, more irregular. She would go long periods without taking a breath, then suddenly gasp, as if she was remembering she needed air. Sarah had explained that this was normal, part of the dying process. But it was terrifying to watch. William had started keeping vigil by her bedside around the clock, afraid she might slip away when he wasn't there. His children had tried to convince him to rest, to let them take turns watching over their mother, but he couldn't leave her side. "I need to be here," he had explained to Michael when his son had brought him coffee and toast he couldn't eat. "I need to be the last thing she sees." On December 8th, Catherine had opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days. William had been reading aloud from Pride and Prejudice, her favorite novel, when he noticed her looking directly at him. Her eyes were unfocused but aware, and she seemed to be trying to speak. "Catherine," he had whispered, taking her hand. "I'm here. I'm right here." She had moved her lips, but no sound came out at first. William had leaned closer, his ear near her mouth, straining to hear whatever she was trying to say. "Tired," she had finally managed to whisper. "So tired." "I know," he had said, stroking her forehead gently. "You can rest. You can let go when you're ready." She had looked at him then with an intensity that surprised him, as if she was gathering all her remaining strength for something important. Her grip on his hand had tightened slightly. "Love," she had whispered. "Always love." "Always," he had promised. "I will always love you." Catherine had closed her eyes again, but her breathing had seemed more peaceful afterward, as if she had been waiting to say those words, waiting to hear his response. The family had gathered in the bedroom that evening, sensing that time was running short. They had shared stories about Catherine, had laughed about funny memories, had cried together for the woman they were losing. The grandchildren had curled up on the floor next to the bed, reluctant to leave their grandmother even to sleep. William had noticed the change in Catherine's breathing around midnight. The pauses between breaths had become longer, her chest rising and falling with obvious effort. Sarah had checked Catherine's pulse and had given William a meaningful look. "Soon," she had mouthed silently. The next few hours had passed in a dreamlike state. William had held Catherine's hand while their children took turns saying their final goodbyes. Michael had thanked her for being a wonderful mother, for teaching him how to be a good father. Sarah had promised to take care of the family recipes, to pass down the stories Catherine had shared with her. David had simply whispered, "I love you, Mom," over and over, as if the repetition could somehow keep her with them longer. As dawn broke on December 9th, Catherine's breathing had become so shallow it was barely visible. William had climbed into bed beside her, had wrapped his arms around her frail body, had whispered memories of their happiest times together. "Do you remember our wedding day?" he had murmured against her ear. "How nervous you were that morning, how beautiful you looked walking down the aisle. I knew that day that I was the luckiest man alive." Catherine had stirred slightly, and William had thought he felt her try to move closer to him. "And when the children were born," he had continued, "how excited you were each time, how you cried happy tears when you held them for the first time. You were the best mother they could have asked for." He had talked about their early years together, about building their life piece by piece, about all the ordinary moments that had made up an extraordinary love story. He had reminded her of birthday celebrations and anniversary dinners, of quiet Sunday mornings and late-night conversations, of all the ways she had made his life complete. "Thank you," he had whispered finally. "Thank you for loving me, for choosing me, for giving me the most beautiful life I could have imagined." At exactly 7:30 that morning, Catherine had taken what William would later realize was her final breath. It had been so quiet, so gentle, that he hadn't immediately understood what had happened. She had simply stopped breathing, as peacefully as falling asleep. William had held her for several more minutes, unwilling to let go, unwilling to accept that she was really gone. Her body had still been warm, had still felt like Catherine, and for a few precious moments he had been able to pretend that nothing had changed. It was Michael who had finally touched his shoulder gently, who had spoken the words that made it real. "She's gone, Dad," his son had said softly. "Mom's gone." That was when William had truly broken down, when the grief he had been holding back for months had finally overwhelmed him. He had sobbed against Catherine's still chest, had begged her not to leave him, had pleaded with God or the universe or anyone who might be listening to bring her back. His children had surrounded him then, had held him while he fell apart, had let him grieve without trying to make him stop or be strong or think about what came next. They had understood that he needed those moments to say goodbye to the only woman he had ever loved, to the partner who had shared more than half his life. Sarah, the nurse, had been called, had come to help with the arrangements, to guide the family through the immediate steps that needed to be taken. William had been grateful for her gentle efficiency, for the way she had handled the practical details while he struggled to accept the emotional reality. The funeral director had arrived later that morning, and William had watched in numb shock as they had prepared to take Catherine's body away. Even though he had known this moment was coming, even though he had tried to prepare himself, seeing her being wheeled out of their bedroom had felt surreal and wrong. "Wait," he had called out suddenly, stopping the funeral director at the front door. He had gone back to Catherine's bedside and had picked up her wedding ring, which Sarah had removed and placed on the nightstand. William had held the simple gold band that Catherine had worn for 32 years, that had been a symbol of all their promises to each other. For a moment he had considered keeping it, wearing it on a chain around his neck so she would always be close to his heart. But then he had thought about what Catherine would want, about the conversations they had had about death and loss and moving forward. He had slipped the ring into his pocket, deciding to bury it with her. It belonged with Catherine, just as his heart would always belong with her, even though she was gone. The funeral had been everything Catherine would have wanted. The small church where they had been married was filled with people whose lives she had touched. Former students, now adults with children of their own, had traveled from different states to pay their respects to the teacher who had made a difference in their lives. Colleagues from the elementary school had shared stories about Catherine's dedication, her creativity, her ability to reach even the most challenging students. William had sat in the front pew, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, listening to story after story about the woman he had loved. He had learned things about Catherine that day that he had never known, heard about small acts of kindness she had never mentioned, understood more fully how many people had been blessed by her presence in the world. "She stayed after school every day to help me with reading," one young woman had shared during the service. "I was struggling, and other teachers had given up on me, but Mrs. Henderson never did. She made me believe I was smart. I'm a teacher now because of her." An elderly man had stood up to talk about how Catherine had visited his mother in the nursing home, how she had brought her students to sing Christmas carols for the residents, how she had continued those visits even after his mother had stopped recognizing anyone. "Your wife had the biggest heart," he had told William after the service. "She made my mother's last years brighter." These stories had been both comforting and heartbreaking for William. They had confirmed what he had always known about Catherine, but they had also reminded him of everything the world had lost when she died. The burial had been private, just family gathered around the simple grave in the church cemetery. William had placed Catherine's wedding ring on top of her casket before it was lowered into the ground, had whispered a final goodbye to the woman who had been his everything. "I'll see you again someday," he had promised, though he wasn't sure what he believed about life after death. "Wait for me." The weeks after the funeral had been the hardest of William's life. His children had stayed for several days, had helped him sort through Catherine's belongings, had tried to establish routines that would help him adjust to living alone, but eventually they had needed to return to their own lives, leaving William in a house that felt too big and too quiet without Catherine's presence. Everything reminded him of her. The kitchen where she had made thousands of meals, the living room where they had watched television together in the evenings, the bedroom where they had shared their dreams and fears, and the intimacy that comes from loving someone completely. Even the grocery store had become painful because he kept reaching for foods that Catherine had enjoyed. kept buying ingredients for meals he would be eating alone. The isolation had been overwhelming at first. After 32 years of marriage, William had forgotten how to be just himself instead of half of a couple. He had caught himself setting two places at the table, had reached for the phone to call Catherine when something interesting happened, had turned to share a thought with her before remembering she wasn't there. Sleep had been impossible in their bedroom, so William had moved to the guest room, unable to bear the emptiness of the space they had shared for so many years. But even there, he had lain awake for hours, his mind spinning with memories and regrets and questions about how to continue living without the person who had given his life meaning. Depression had settled over him like a heavy blanket. There had been days when he hadn't gotten out of bed, hadn't showered or eaten or answered the phone when friends called to check on him. The future had seemed impossibly long and empty, a series of days to be endured rather than lived. Michael had called every evening, and William had tried to sound okay for his son's sake, but his voice had given him away. And after a few weeks, Michael had driven up from Atlanta to spend a long weekend trying to pull his father out of his grief. "Mom wouldn't want you to give up," Michael had said gently as they sat together in the kitchen, surrounded by the sympathy cards that William hadn't had the energy to open. "She'd want you to find ways to be happy again." "I don't know how to be happy without her," William had admitted. "I don't even know who I am without her." They had talked for hours that weekend about grief and healing and the different ways people cope with loss. Michael had shared his own struggles with losing his mother, had admitted that he sometimes called her phone number just to hear her voice on the voicemail recording. "But I'm also trying to live in a way that would make her proud," Michael had said. "I'm trying to be the kind of father she taught me to be, the kind of man she raised me to become." Those conversations had planted a seed in William's mind, though it had taken months for it to grow into something actionable. Slowly, very slowly, he had begun to think about what Catherine would want him to do with the rest of his life. Spring had arrived while William was still deep in his grief, and one morning in early April, he had noticed that the bulbs Catherine had planted the previous fall were beginning to bloom. Daffodils and tulips were pushing up through the soil, creating splashes of color in their garden, despite the fact that no one had been caring for them. The sight had moved him to tears, but it had also reminded him of Catherine's love for growing things, her belief that beauty could emerge from the darkest times. He had remembered his promise to plant the climbing roses she had wanted by their bedroom window. That afternoon, William had forced himself to leave the house for the first time in weeks. He had driven to the garden center where Catherine had always bought her plants, had wandered the aisles feeling lost and overwhelmed by all the choices. "Can I help you find something?" a young employee had asked, and William had nearly broken down right there among the flowering plants. "My wife wanted climbing roses," he had managed to say, "for our bedroom window." The young man had been patient and kind, had shown William several varieties that would thrive in their yard, had explained how to plant them and care for them. William had bought 3 rose bushes, along with a trellis and some basic gardening tools. Planting those roses had been the hardest and most healing thing William had done since Catherine's death. Every shovel of dirt had been an act of love. Every plant placed in the ground had been a promise kept. He had worked slowly, carefully, talking to Catherine as if she could hear him. "These are for you," he had whispered as he patted soil around the roots of the first bush. "They'll bloom every summer and remind me of how much you loved beautiful things." As he had worked, neighbors had stopped to talk, people who had known and loved Catherine. They had shared their own memories of her, had offered help with the garden, had invited William to join them for coffee or dinner when he was ready. Mrs. Patterson from next door had been especially kind. She had brought William homemade soup when she noticed he wasn't taking care of himself, had offered to help with grocery shopping, had simply sat with him on his front porch when words weren't necessary. Catherine was lucky to have someone who loved her so completely, she had said one evening as they watched the sun set. And you were lucky to have that kind of love in your life. I feel more cursed than lucky right now, William had replied honestly. That's grief talking, Mrs. Patterson had said gently. Love that deep doesn't just disappear when someone dies. It transforms into something else, something that can sustain you if you let it. William hadn't understood what she meant at the time, but as the months passed and the roses began to grow, he had started to see glimpses of what she was talking about. The love he felt for Catherine hadn't died with her. It was still there, as strong as ever, but it had evolved into something that connected him to the world rather than isolating him from it. By summer, the roses had grown tall enough to begin climbing the trellis William had installed below their bedroom window. When they bloomed for the first time, the sight had taken his breath away. Pink and white flowers covered the vines, filling the air with fragrance, creating exactly the kind of beauty Catherine had envisioned. William had stood in their backyard, looking up at the window where he and Catherine had shared so many mornings, and had felt something he hadn't experienced since her death. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace, a sense that he was honoring her memory in a way that mattered. That evening, he had called his children to tell them about the roses. Sarah had cried when he described them, had made plans to visit soon so she could see them herself. David had asked for photos, had said he wanted to plant roses in his own yard as a way of remembering his mother. She would have loved them, Michael had said when he saw the pictures William had sent. She would have been so happy that you kept your promise. The roses had marked a turning point for William. He had begun to take better care of himself, had started eating regular meals and answering his phone when friends called. He had returned to work at the hardware store part-time, grateful for the routine and the purpose it provided. Customers had been understanding about his absence, had expressed their condolences, had shared their own stories of loss and recovery. William had found comfort in these conversations, had begun to understand that grief was something people carried together rather than something they had to bear alone. One day in late summer, a young couple had come into the store looking for supplies to start their first garden. They had been newly married, full of enthusiasm and plans for the future, and watching them had reminded William of himself and Catherine when they were young. "We want to plant roses," the young woman had said excitedly. "Something romantic for our first home together." William had helped them choose varieties that would thrive in their soil, had given them advice about planting and care, had found himself genuinely enjoying their excitement and optimism. As they had left with their purchases, the young man had turned back to thank him. "You really know about roses," he had said. "Our garden is going to be beautiful because of your help." That interaction had given William an idea that would eventually change everything. He had always enjoyed helping people, and Catherine had often said he had a gift for explaining things in ways that made sense. What if he could find ways to share what he had learned about gardening, about growing beautiful things from difficult circumstances? He had started small, volunteering to help with the community garden behind the library. Many of the plots were tended by elderly residents who needed assistance with the heavier work, and William had found purpose in helping them maintain their small patches of vegetables and flowers. "You have magic hands, Mrs. Iker," Chen had told him after he had helped her struggling tomato plants recover from a pest problem. "Everything you touch seems to grow better." "I learned from my wife," William had replied. "She believed that love could make anything grow." Working in the community garden had connected William with other people who were dealing with their own struggles and losses. There was Mr. Rodriguez, whose wife had moved into memory care, leaving him alone for the first time in 50 years. There was Linda, a single mother who was trying to teach her children where food came from while stretching a tight budget. There was Tom, a veteran dealing with PTSD who found peace in working with his hands in the soil. These people had become William's friends, his chosen family in a life that had been reorganized by loss. They had shared stories and advice, and the satisfaction of watching things grow under their care. William had begun to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting Catherine or moving on from their love. It meant finding ways to honor that love by caring for other people, by making the world a little more beautiful, by keeping her spirit alive through his actions. One evening in early fall, William had been working in Catherine's rose garden when he had noticed a woman standing at his fence, watching him tend the plants. She had been older, maybe in her 70s, with gray hair and kind eyes that reminded him somehow of Catherine. "Excuse me," she had called out hesitantly. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but could you tell me about those roses? They're the most beautiful ones I've ever seen." William had walked over to the fence and had begun explaining about the different varieties, about how to care for them, about the trellis system that allowed them to climb toward the light. As they had talked, he had learned that the woman, whose name was Eleanor, had recently moved into the neighborhood after her husband's death. "I'm trying to start over," she had explained. "I want to plant a garden at my new house, something that will give me hope, but I don't know where to begin." William had offered to help her plan her garden, had found himself looking forward to sharing what Catherine had taught him about creating beauty. Over the following weeks, he had helped Eleanor design and plant a garden that would bloom through multiple seasons, that would provide her with both beauty and purpose. "You've given me something to look forward to," Eleanor had said as they had worked together one afternoon. "For the first time since Harold died, I feel excited about tomorrow." That comment had made William realize how far he had come in his own healing journey. He was still deeply sad about losing Catherine, probably would be for the rest of his life, but he had found ways to channel that sadness into something meaningful. He was helping people, making connections, honoring Catherine's memory by living in a way that would make her proud. As winter approached again, marking the first anniversary of Catherine's death, William had felt ready to take a bigger step. He had decided to offer gardening classes through the community center, to share what he had learned about growing things and about growing through grief. From Grief to Growth, Healing Through Gardening had been the title of his first class, and he had been nervous about whether anyone would come. But the room had been full of people dealing with various kinds of loss, people who were looking for ways to create beauty from pain. William had talked about soil preparation and plant selection, but he had also talked about patience and hope and the way that tending growing things could help heal a broken heart. He had shared his story about Catherine's roses, about keeping promises to people we love even after they're gone. "Gardening teaches us that death isn't the end of the story," he had said to the group of attentive faces. "It teaches us that beautiful things can grow from the darkest times, that love continues to bloom even after loss." After that class, several people had approached William to thank him and to ask for more specific help with their own gardens. Word had spread, and soon he had been invited to speak at other community centers, at senior centers, at grief support groups that wanted to learn about healing through connection with growing things. These speaking engagements had given William's life new purpose and meaning. He was still the man who had loved Catherine Henderson with all his heart, but he was also becoming someone new, someone who could help other people find their way through loss toward hope. On the first anniversary of Catherine's death, William had stood in front of the roses that were now dormant for winter but would bloom again in spring. He had talked to Catherine the way he always did, had told her about the people he was helping, about the gardens that were being planted because of her inspiration. "I'm keeping my promise," he had said to the winter air. "I'm planting beauty everywhere I go, just like you did." As he had stood there, a cardinal had landed on the rose trellis and had looked directly at him with bright, alert eyes. Catherine had always loved cardinals, had believed they were messengers from heaven. William didn't know if he believed that, but seeing the bird had filled him with a sense of peace and connection that felt like a gift. The bird had stayed for several minutes, as if it had a message to deliver, and William had found himself speaking aloud the words he carried in his heart every day. "I love you, Catherine. I will always love you. And I promise to keep growing beautiful things in your memory." The cardinal had tilted its head as if listening, then had flown away into the gray December sky. William had watched it disappear, had felt Catherine's presence as strongly as if she had been standing beside him. He wasn't the same man he had been before her death, would never again be the person who had shared his life so completely with another human being. But he was learning to be someone new, someone who carried Catherine's love forward into the world through acts of service and beauty and hope. The roses would bloom again in spring, and William would be there to tend them. The people in his gardening classes would plant seeds and watch them grow into something wonderful, and somewhere in the mystery of love that transcends death, Catherine would be smiling, proud of the man her husband was becoming, grateful that their love story continued to create beauty in the world even after her voice had fallen silent. William walked back toward the house that evening, no longer empty but full of memories and purpose and the quiet satisfaction that comes from a life lived in service to love. Tomorrow he would help Mrs. Patterson plan her spring bulbs. Next week he would teach another gardening class. Next month he would visit Eleanor's garden and admire how much it had grown. Catherine was gone, but their love remained, planted deep in the soil of his heart, ready to bloom in new and beautiful ways for all the years that lay ahead.